The knock hit the steel door like a warning shot, heavy, slow, intentional. On the other side, a man who had controlled Chicago with blood and money for nearly a decade paused mid-stride, the echo of his own breath loud in the cold hallway of his mansion. For the first time in years, Alphonse Capone felt something slip beneath his feet. It was control, it was certainty, and it was the beginning of the end. Federal agents waited outside in the dim gray of the morning, their breath rising in clouds as they held the warrant that would crack open the empire everyone said was untouchable. Inside, Capone's men whispered among themselves, restless and unsure. They had guns, they had power. But the FBI had been building something stronger, a silent case stitched together through paper trails, coded ledgers, and frightened men ready to talk for immunity. Capone stepped toward the window, the mansion quiet around him. The curtains swayed from the draft that always seemed to slither through the halls. He pulled them aside just enough to see the silhouettes waiting near the gates. He recognized the stance of trained men, shoulders squared, feet planted, eyes fixed. They weren't here for intimidation, they had come for him. Down the street, an unmarked black Ford rested in shadow. Inside, Special Agent Frank Wilson leaned forward, hands clasped tight. He had spent 3 years hunting Capone, not with bullets or raids, but with ink, numbers, hidden transactions, names tucked inside coded books recovered from backroom raids. For months he had lived in this world of smoke-filled speakeasies and terrified informants. He had walked into rooms where eyes watched him like hawks, where one wrong question could have meant a shallow grave outside Cicero. Now, as he watched Capone's mansion, Wilson felt the weight of everything that had led here. Men killed in alleys, judges bribed, witnesses vanishing into the night. Chicago had become a war zone dressed as a city, and the man inside that mansion had been the architect. Capone finally opened the door. The morning light hit his face, sharpening the lines of stress he tried to hide. "What's this about?" he asked, voice low. "Federal warrant," the lead agent said. "You're coming with us." Capone smiled, but it was weak. "You think you've got something?" Wilson stepped forward. "We do." The mansion was searched, papers confiscated, safe boxers cracked open. The agents moved carefully through the rooms, aware that each drawer might hold evidence or a trap. Every man in the room understood the gravity of what they were touching. These were not simple ledgers. They were the veins of the criminal empire that had bled Chicago for years. A clerk found a small leather-bound notebook in a hidden drawer behind Capone's desk. The pages were covered in neat handwriting, dates, initials, dollar amounts. Wilson's pulse kicked. He lifted the book gently, like it might burn through his gloves. One agent looked over his shoulder and whispered, "Is that what I think it is?" Wilson nodded. "This is enough to start the collapse." Capone was taken downtown. Reporters swarmed the vehicles, their flashbulbs lighting the street like a storm of white sparks. "Is this the end, Al?" one shouted. Capone kept his gaze forward, jaw tight. His silence was the first crack anyone had seen in his armor. Inside the federal building, the atmosphere was different. Dim lights, cold air, the smell of ink, paper, and sweat mixing in the narrow halls. Agents walked briskly, arms full of documents and photographs. Every step echoed like footsteps in an empty cathedral. Wilson carried the notebook into a small room where a team of accountants sat hunched over desks littered with receipts, testimonies, and typed reports. The men looked up, exhausted but alert. "We got it," Wilson said. One accountant rubbed his eyes. "Is it solid?" "As solid as anything we're going to get." 4 months after that day, the FBI worked in secrecy. They decoded entries, matched signatures, pulled former associates out of the shadows. Some came willingly, others broke after hours of confrontation. One man, trembling, confessed everything as he rubbed his wrists. Still raw from handcuffs. "If I talk, I'm dead," he whispered. "You talk," Wilson said, "and you live long enough to see him fall." The testimony flowed slowly. Each word added weight to the case. Agents traveled through rain-soaked alleys, boarded-up buildings, and smoky back rooms, where fear hung thick in the air. They pieced together a financial trail that wound through brothels, speakeasies, gambling dens, and corrupt officials who had bent the knee to Capone for envelopes stuffed with cash. One night, Wilson sat alone in his office, the lamplight casting long shadows on the walls. The building was quiet except for the faint hum of distant typewriters. His desk was covered with documents linking Capone to tax evasion on a massive scale. Wilson stared at the numbers, the careful arithmetic that might finally bring down the most violent man in America. A knock sounded at his door. Another agent stepped in. "Frank, you should get some sleep." Wilson shook his head. "Not until this is airtight. It already is. Not enough. Not for him." By the time the case was ready, the atmosphere in Chicago shifted. People whispered about the possibility. Politicians grew nervous. Journalists waited like vultures. Even Capone's own men began to show signs of tension. The empire sensed the tremor under its foundation. Trial day arrived like a storm. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, officers, ordinary citizens who had lived through years of fear. Capone entered wearing a tailored suit, his expression smug but tense around the edges. He looked out at the crowd, searching for control he no longer had. Wilson took the stand with the quiet confidence of a man who had built this case piece by piece. The prosecutor handed him the ledger. Wilson opened it slowly, letting the pages catch the light. The courtroom fell silent. "These entries," he said, "represent payments made directly under the orders of Alphonse Capone." Capone's lawyer objected. The judge overruled. The rhythm of the trial became a steady march toward truth. Accountants explained the hidden income. Witnesses spoke in cracked voices. A former bookkeeper described how Capone would walk into back rooms, his hat pulled low, demanding totals for profits that never reached any tax form. He said nobody could touch him, the man said softly. Capone watched him with cold eyes, the kind that could freeze a man's courage. But the testimony continued. The climax came when Wilson presented the final breakdown. Years of unreported income tied to the most violent criminal operations in the country. The numbers were exact, the evidence undeniable. Capone's face finally changed. His jaw tightened. His hand gripped the table. For the first time he understood that guns couldn't save him from arithmetic. The jury deliberated for only a few hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice was steady. "Guilty." The word hung in the air like the crack of a whip. Reporters exploded into shouts. Capone sat still, stunned. His empire built on blood and fear had been undone by ink and patience. Later, as he was escorted down a long corridor lined with federal officers, Capone muttered, "Tax problems." "Of all the things," one agent replied quietly, "crime always leaves a trail. You just thought yours disappeared." The door to the transport vehicle slammed shut. Metal echoed down the hall. Capone stared ahead, knowing the world outside would never again bend to him. Back in his office, Wilson stood alone. He looked at the empty chair across from him, the desk littered with the remnants of 3 years of his life. The building felt quieter than usual, like the air itself was exhaling after a long fight. He picked up the notebook one last time, its pages worn and fragile. A simple object, yet powerful enough to dismantle a kingdom. He placed it gently in an evidence box. The room dimmed as he turned off the lamp. On his way out, he paused at the doorway, listening to the silence that replaced the chaos Capone had ruled over. Outside, the city lights flickered. Chicago was still scarred, still healing, but for the first time in years, there was a sense of balance returning. The man who had thought himself invincible was behind bars, and the people who had lived in fear could breathe again. As Wilson stepped into the night, he knew the case would be studied for decades, not because of its violence, but because of what it proved. Even the most powerful criminals could crumble when someone followed the smallest thread long enough. Power fades, empires fall, but the truth, once uncovered, has a way of dragging even the darkest figures into the light. And in the quiet aftermath of Capone's downfall, the city whispered a lesson that would echo through history. The strongest walls aren't broken by force, but by persistence that never looks away. The night swallowed Wilson as he walked toward his car, the cold air brushing against him. In the silence, the truth of the moment settled like dust in an empty room. Even kings can be taken down. All it takes is someone willing to follow the trail until the very end. It was the kind of ending that left a city staring into its own shadows, wondering how much darkness a man can build before it finally consumes him.